Good morning. My name is Mark Weber, and we are here for Forums That Matter. I'm a member of the Forum Committee and I guess coordinator. I don't do much coordinating, but coordinator of today's program, which is Belief and the Ballot, Religion in American Politics. That's a nice narrow topic that should fit well in a 30-minute segment. We'll have Q&A about 9:30 until 10. The mics will be passed for our in-person audience. We ask our virtual audience to put questions in the Q&A box. Now, I did want to add that what we welcome are questions that resemble a question. In other words, declarations or confessions, perhaps not. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Professor Dr. Joseph White is the Luxembourg Family Professor of Public Policy Studies at Case Western Reserve University. Taking a little bit of a liberty, I would say that Professor White's views are that understanding religious divisions in the United States are central really to understanding our contemporary politics and all of its challenges. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Joseph?
Thank you. It's on now, right? Okay. I should say one thing. If you're interested in getting together and talking with people about hearing people talk about public policy issues, I also organize what's called the Friday Public Affairs Discussion Group at Case Western, which meets every Friday of fall and spring semesters, and in the library, in Calvert Smith Library, and has a wide range of topics. So if you're curious, look up Friday Lunch Case Western, and you'll find the schedule of events. The next one actually is David Cohen from the University of Akron talking about the Trump administration. So that might get a little crowded, but some of it's more technical. So I mean, for instance, the last one was on basically organ donations. What because people have been trying to figure out as to who should get organs. And why? Okay. So I'm going to try to go through a bunch of stuff and we'll see how I manage it. I want to emphasize that if you're interested in this topic, there are some key sources in terms of data. The Pew, P-E-W Research Center. If you go on Pew, you'll find lots of stuff. And then I'd recommend two books. One is by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, Taking America Back for God. Easy one to remember. Christian nationalism in the United States. And the second is by a guy named Ryan, I'm going to pronounce his name Berg. I don't know, I've never met him, B-U-R-G-E. Just came out in January. It's called The Vanishing Church, How the Hollowing Out of Moderate Congregations is Hurting Democracy, Faith, and Us. And he has a Substack called Graphs About Religion, which is really good. So the key issue to me about is the relationship between religious beliefs and voting or other political behavior. And as a rough outline, I'm going to talk a little about basic data. I'm going to talk a lot about ideology and developments over time, because I would say that you actually have to understand religion, religious factors to understand all of American political history going back to the founding. I would argue that the basic divisions in American politics, other than race, have been largely religious. Most of that then is about ideology is an old story, very long-term tendencies in U.S. politics. But of course, it also does involve interaction of religion with other factors. And it's important to remember that it was never just about voting behavior. The churches have been one of the main organizational bases for political action, well, again, throughout our history, whether from the abolitionist movement to the prohibitionist movement, to the civil rights movement. Basically, if you look at and then you want to look at something like the recent elections. My description of what happened in Ohio between 2000 and 2004 is that in 2000, the unions beat the evangelical churches, and in 2004, the evangelical churches beat the unions in terms of driving turnout. I also want to emphasize that there have been significant changes in the past 4 decades. When I worked out my understanding of relationship between religion and political beliefs and ideology in the United States, that was back in the 1980s when I was in graduate school. Another scholar, Jim Marone, figured out something very similar around the same time. But in the past 4 decades, a bunch of stuff has been happening. The most important is the decline of mainstream Protestantism and the relative rise of evangelicalism. There's also the mobilization and radicalization of the evangelicals, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and beyond. There's a move to the left or the center, sort of, among the old but shrinking mainstream. There's the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. What is your religion? None. The Catholic Church, somewhat moving right. And then, of course, racial division among Christians, which means black and white Protestants and white versus Asian versus Hispanic among Catholics. I'll talk a little about the reasons for change, although maybe we'll say that mostly for later discussion. But I want to emphasize, one is the internal dynamics of denomination. I want to set out there that a large part of what happened in mainstream Protestantism, moving sort of left, happened in the seminaries. It was part of the training of the clergy and beliefs among the clergy. On the other hand, the Catholic Church moved right because John Paul II pushed it. John Paul II said abortion is more important than social justice. Well, abortion is maybe the most important aspect of social justice, depending on how you want to look at this, avoiding killing babies. And you can now see some small reversals within the Catholic Church, also leadership driven, with Francis and then Leo. Now, of course, leadership is a lot more visible in the Holy Roman Catholic Church than in any other form of religion. Okay, but I'm pretty confident that there is a clergy-driven or a internal clergy dynamic that is part of the story of religious change in the United States. Another dynamic is exit. People leaving religious denominations by death, with non-replacement more common in some denominations, or by defection. And on balance, one of Berg's points is that this has led to concentration of the more committed and extreme within the remaining membership, as less committed or extreme head off to none land. And I should emphasize another side of this is who's coming to the country. There ain't a whole lot of Lutherans emigrating to the United States. As Trump said, why can't we get any Swedes? Why don't people move from Sweden? Because it's nicer in Sweden. But you're not getting a bunch of mainline Protestants moving to the United States. You do get some Catholics. Of course, there's another dynamic of social communication processes, the internet. People have written a lot about the great sort among geographically, Democrats moving to live with Democrats, Republicans moving to live with Republicans, but it's also happening religiously. Seemingly party driving religion as much or more than the reverse, and was always somewhat true, but I think that's becoming a more important reason. And there are combinations between religious belief and identity politics, particularly for Hispanics and to some extent whites with the rise of Christian nationalism. Note that Christian nationalists think they've been a major theme since the revolution, but no, they weren't, not that. I'm sorry, no. Okay, basic data. What do the parties disagree about? But to put the question another way, to what extent and in what way are adherents to the two parties different? This is an extremely delicate question, so I'll place strong statements now all of it. Parties in the electorate differ both in terms of individual demographic characteristics, so group identity, and political beliefs. But more and more party affiliation itself is a form of identity for some people. I say more and more, but it was always something true. We learn our party affiliation from our parents. Right? That's where we get it, basically. Many people are Republicans or Democrats because they were raised by parents of that party who taught them that Republicans were good and Democrats bad. My daughter learned that when she was about 8. Okay. Now, when she was 3, she already knew there was a baseball team named the Evil Hankies. Okay. But you get your beliefs from other people, and particularly parents. Of course, people revolt, and we notice the revolt, but substantially you get your beliefs from your parents. It is important to remember that though religious denominations have belief structures, they also can be identities. And that's most obvious for Mormons and Jews. Where the religion is associated with a story about who we are and how we do or do not fit in. But it can also be said to varying degrees of other religions, such as Catholics or even evangelicals and mainstream Protestants. And for everyone except the nuns, any identity is reinforced to the extent religious people gather in groups with each other and not with other people in these things called churches or mosques or synagogues. At the same time, some religions, and most especially Catholics, can be viewed as made up of people who among them have a few distinctly different identities that may have according to the book. In particular, among Catholics, white versus Asian versus Hispanic in the United States. Obviously, Hispanic doesn't mean anything in Brazil. And of course, white evangelical Protestants and black evangelical Protestants have very different political meanings. And the evangelical thing gets wiped out by the base. Whether because religious beliefs have an affinity with certain political beliefs, or versions of identity, or because people who attend services are essentially lobbied from the pulpit and by the people next to them in the pews, religion is a stronger predictor of party affiliation than anything other than the black-white divide. The standard data comes from Pew, and a year ago, Pew reported from their most recent survey that Protestants identified as Republican or lead Republican by 58 to 35%. But within that, evangelical Protestants were 70 to 24 Republican. Mainline Protestants were 51 to 41% Republican. And by the way, those evangelical Protestants included blacks. So if you take the white evangelical Protestants, it was much more heavily Republican. Catholics tended Republican by 49 to 44. And by the way, Orthodox Christians, God knows how many of those there were in the data, very simple, essentially the same as Catholics. So who leaned Democratic? Essentially everybody else. Plus black Protestants, who were hidden in the other data. Other religions have a small set of people who favor Democrats by 59 to 33%. That is led by Jews, 66 to 31% Democratic leaning. But the religiously unaffiliated or nuns favored Democrats by 62 to 31%. And if you divide the nuns into people who say, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, I'm just not really religious, I'm not affiliated with anything, there's a clear dynamic with the atheists being much more Democratic. And then the agnostics, and then the nothing in particular. This nets out for a close particular partisan divide among the nation as a whole, basically because the nuns balance out the evangelicals. And that is because of the basic divide of affiliations from the public. Again, in the most recent Pew data from 2023 to 24, among 100 Americans, this won't add to 100, sorry, it's rounding error. 23 are evangelicals, 19 are Catholics, 11 are mainline Protestants, 5 identify with historically black Protestant denominations, 2 are Mormons, 2 identify with other sort of small groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists. For a total of 60 Christians. But 7 would be other religions, and 29 would have no religious affiliation. No religious affiliation is now the modal religion in the United States. Compare that to 1952 when I was born, when the modal was mainstream Protestants who were half the country. So basically, Democrats were big about non-Christians to make up for their substantial losses among Protestants and especially evangelical Protestants. And among people with any religious affiliation, degree of commitment to religion tends to be Republicans. Now, what do we mean by degree of commitment? Whether you say you believe in God, how often you attend services, and so on. And that is true among Catholics as well as Protestants. I'm quite sure it's true among Jews as well, since the Orthodox, who are much more observant, are less democratic leaning than the Reform. Using a scale from answers to questions about like belief, religion, and support and frequency attend services, whites who are highly religious favor the Republicans 77 to 18%, while people who are low on that scale favor the Democrats 68 to 28%. Highly religious Hispanics favor the Republicans by 48 to 40. While Hispanics who are low on the scale favor Democrats by 68 to 26. But a lot of religiousness have nothing to do with blacks, basically, because blacks basically almost all vote Democratic anyway, because they think the Republicans hate them. Okay. Now, the story of religion in American politics is not static. We are in a mainline Protestant church today. Over the past decade or so, we have seen a tectonic shift in religious affiliations in the United States, with the mainline denominations being in a very sharp decline, largely displaced first by evangelicals in the 1960s to 1980s, and especially since then by the nuns. Who do I mean by the mainline? Episcopalians, Methodists, UCC, Disciples of Christ, Lutheran Church in America, Presbyterian Church, American Baptist Church, Fairmont and Eaton, right? Riverside Church and up on the Upper West Side, not those people in the South. These churches in general are major factors in the rise of social gospel Protestantism in the late 19th century, and the social progress movements ranging from abolitionism to prohibition to the civil rights movement. But in spite of those leanings, on the whole, they historically were politically moderate, or maybe better described as divided, with members of sort of all political leanings, some Republicans, some Democrats. As they are today, if you look at the data, though that might seem less clear in this group. I mentioned when I was born in 1952, about half of all Americans were associated with mainline churches. By the early 70s, that was about 30%. It was still 29% in 1982. But the mainline lost a third of its members during the Reagan years, and another half of the remaining members afterwards. By 2022, only 9% of Americans were affiliated with those denominations. So 50%. Meanwhile, the population share of evangelicals, defined by denominational affiliation, rose from about 17% in 1972 to 30% 2 decades later. And I want to emphasize also, evangelicals got a lot more political. One of the definitions of evangelicals in 1970 would have been sort of trying to separate yourself from the secular world. Obviously, that changed with Jerry Falwell and Pat Levinson and talk about taxing religious private schools and so on. It's a bit less now, and the numbers, the survey changed the definitions. But the basic story is that evangelicals became a larger share of Christians and a clearly conservative group among whites, as opposed to a smaller share of Christians and a not particularly political group. The mainstream basically lost more conservative members to the evangelicals, but it also lost a bunch of members who left Christianity altogether. Probably this is generational. It's not just that mainstream Protestant kids left the faith, but that they had fewer kids. But the rise of the nuns is arguably the most stunning trend of all, at least in terms of the answers people would give on surveys. As Ryan Bird shows, it has basically happened since about the time of Bill Clinton's election. In the surveys he uses, in 1972, only 5% would admit to religious affiliation. Around 1990, it was still 6%. But by 2012, it was 20%. And in 2022, though there's sampling question, 28%. And the data I gave you was 2024. This has meant that Americans over time, Berg argues, have sorted themselves by ideology, not only through neighborhood, but by religion. At the end of the talk, I'll speculate about a bit about the reasons for that trend. But first, what do religious divisions mean in terms of political substance? And how have they been affiliated with politics over time? I want to emphasize there is no perfect consistency among identity issues in which party people support an election. There are Jewish Republicans, there are Mormon Democrats, and there are even pro-choice Republicans or pro-gun Democrats. But the fact that I can give you those examples and you all know what I'm talking about means there are strong associations also. I would argue that both group allegiances and ideological beliefs have followed clear patterns for the entire history of the country, basically. The Federalist Whigs and then Republicans were the parties of the socially dominant group, basically WASP Yankees. The Democrats have always been the party of minorities or non-mainstream populations of one sort or another, of Catholic immigrants in the 1830s, of Southern whites after the Civil War. If you were black in the South, you didn't think they were minority. You may not think of them as a subordinate group, but remember, they're just a bloody war to the rest of the country and certainly felt subordinated. Of immigrants, Catholics and women Catholics and Jews during the Industrial Revolution, and with much more support from blacks, Hispanics, women, and gays than from straight white males today. One could argue the Southern whites have tended Republican precisely as the memory of the Civil War finally faded and the industrialization of the South made Southern whites feel more like whites in the rest of the country. The socially dominant group, as I've termed it, may well not be a majority. That's why Democrats won elections. They also may not see themselves as socially dominant. They may not in part because they feel threatened. Many white males feel today, and as Protestants in the North felt in the face of Catholic immigration to the early 19th and early 20th centuries. And the Prohibition movement is a great example of Protestants feeling threatened by Catholics. But Republicans have historically represented a core group that at least used to have some advantages and see itself as more American than the groups of people that became Democrats. And that goes back 200 years. It's not new. There are complications. WASP, we talk about WASP, but that long ago included both the Yankees and the Scotch-Irish. And the Yankees certainly looked down on the Scotch-Irish. They were political rivals. Democrats were Scotch-Irish. They were the party with the Yankees. Unless the regular Irish were around, in which case the Scotch-Irish sided with the Yankees against the regular Irish. There are differences in circumstance that shape it in particular neighborhoods, particular communities. Italian immigrants became Republicans in New Haven or Philadelphia because the Irish immigrants had the jobs already. They became Republicans. It's a long story, but this has never been about economics, really. It hasn't been about economics consistently. The economic division shifted over time as economic conditions changed, particularly with the closing of the frontier and some other weird things. I mean, basically, Republicans rich people liked big government, liked spending more than less rich, more than particularly manufacturers liked spending more than farmers did, government spending, when the government was funded mainly by tariff. And so tariff were an excuse. Spending was an excuse to have higher tariff, which favored manufacturers over agriculture. When the income tax was invented, all of a sudden, the manufacturers and urban rich people wanted less government spending, so there'd be less need for an income tax. So there's all sorts of factors like that that shape economic policy. So when people talk about freedom or big government, they often think they're talking about economic policies. But I would argue that's not really a consistent division in the United States. Talk about big government is not about the length of government's reach, but about what government should touch. And that's the basic division, what government should touch. In the early 1980s, leftist fellow graduates would tell me the Republican coalition was inherently self-contradictory because Republicans didn't want to regulate the market, but did want to regulate the bedroom. But they wanted to regulate the market, and didn't want to regulate the bedroom. I mean, the leftists were just as inconsistent as the Republicans they were accusing of inconsistent. So if we look at willingness to regulate moral behavior and willingness to regulate the market, there are four basic positions. One, high willingness to regulate both. That does exist among communitarian intellectuals of the 1980s, and especially, particularly before John Paul II, intervened among Catholic bishops. In Europe in the 1980s, this was maybe the dominant position associated with Christian democratic parties, some moral regulation and some economic regulation. Not here. Low willingness to regulate either. That's what we call libertarianism, not a major factor in American politics. Regulate the market, but not the bedroom. That's basically the Democratic Party. And it goes back to Andrew Jackson, to the 1830s with the Conservative Party wanting Sunday restrictions and not to deliver the mail on Sunday. and the Democrat, Andrew Jackson wanting to allow drinking and delivering the mail on Sunday, at least carrying the mail on Sunday, and regulate the bedroom but not the market. That's most of the counter Republican Party. So why would the inconsistent positions be the most prominent? And the answer is because the division of government activism isn't the real division. The stable difference between the two parties that has existed virtually since the founding of the nation involves essentially moral or religious judgments. The parties have different premises about what explains differences in individual faiths. Why do some people have better lives than others? Basically, the Republicans and their predecessors have been disposed to believe that people's faiths depend on their virtue. Good people do well and bad people do worse. If you're poor, that's probably because you were spendthrift or lazy or dumb. If you're rich, you saved and worked hard. Basically, Democrats and their predecessors have tended to believe that people are basically good and differences in individual faith depend not on their virtue, but on luck of the system. People are poor because they were unlucky enough to be born poor and didn't have the opportunity to get a good education, or they worked hard, but the business they worked for went bust. Or in the case of my father, there was an aerospace recession, so he lost his job as an aerospace engineer. And the Democrat view, lots of smart people work hard and don't get rich. If you did, then you happen to be in the right field, but take your money out of the stock market before one of its relevant random crashes. You even got rich not because you were a good person, but because you were nasty and exploited. Not thinking of anybody in particular. Who's prominent in current American politics. Looked at this way, the Republican position on regulation is consistent. You regulate the bedroom so people can succeed if they behave well in the bedroom. This is the Protestant ethic, as it was called, my Mac's favorite. Economic success is proof of your virtue. And the Republicans and their predecessors throughout history have been more likely to talk in moralistic terms. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was a deist. He believed rather vaguely in God, but believed strongly in the fundamental goodness of equality and equality of men. One could call the Jeffersonian tradition secular humanism. Secular because religion is not so central. Humanism because of faith in people per se. For this perspective, of people being basically good is much harder to view differences in their fate as natural or acceptable. There's better reason for government to intervene and fix the results of market competition. And of course, there's less need to regulate moral behavior. Now, those are the terms I came up with: Protestant ethic and secular humanist. Jim Malone's version, being political scientist. I know. Please give me a few minutes. The traditional Republican view is Puritanism, and the Democratic view is the social gospel. My Jewish congregation, Mishkan Torah, emphasizes the social gospel. Jews invented it, after all. I think your congregation basically emphasizes the social. But lots of religious organizations do not. So something like abortion. If you look at abortion, the party that is against abortion because it wants to protect the little children is also the party that doesn't want to educate people and doesn't want to give them health care and doesn't, right? And the party that wants to protect abortion is the party that wants to educate kids and give them health care and so forth. It's not about the kids. It's about the mothers. It's about whether you see the mother as sinning. And as a sinner, abortion just compounds the sin. Or you see abortion as something that the mother got unlucky. And she shouldn't have her life changed by that. It's obviously, there are other things like whether you think of a fetus as a child or not, as a human being or not. But even that is largely related to religious positions. Okay, particularly Catholic churches. So I want to emphasize that ideological logic does not explain all Americans voting. But it looks behind the current dynamics of party and religion and politics. But to that has been added in the last 40 years a much more intense partisan divide, which reinforces. What Berg argues is that people who two things. One is that people do not feel comfortable going to a church with people who disagree with them politically. Secondly, that the image of Christianity, as Christianity in the public sphere becomes not Lutheran, not Methodist, but Jerry Falwell and so on, that the image of Christianity becomes right-wing, that the prominence of the fundamentalists makes Christianity seem right-wing and leads particularly young people to say, I don't want to be part of that. And so you have a reinforcing dynamic where people who lean Democratic start avoiding churches, particularly Protestant. But it's not as if, John Paul II, Catholic Church made things really attractive to liberals either. Okay. And this shows up in immense divisions. A bunch of polls have shown that more respondents would be unhappy if their child married a person of the other party than of a different religion. 35% of Republicans said they would be somewhat very unhappy if their child married a Democrat, compared to 28% for marrying a different religious group, or 25% for a different race or ethnicity. And the gap is much larger. Democrats really don't want their children married. Okay. You asked single people whether they were considered dating a person who was of the other party or had voted for the other candidate in the 2016 election. The potential number say no. So I think it's important but this is all reinforced by the dynamics of religious affiliation, by people avoiding religions where they're going to meet a lot of other people. And Berg's main point is that the growing association between partisanship and religious belief or membership is a self-reinforcing spiral. And as the mainstream loses prominence, its more moderate or liberal versions also become a much less visible face of Christianity. And this leads to people who at one point would have been in the mainstream churches becoming monks. And he would desperately like to rescue the mainstream Protestant churches, but he's not sure how.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? So I wanted to thank Professor White for his really interesting observations about the role of religion in our political divide. We'll now start our Q&A, and we have two Q&A microphone holders, Cliff and Marlene. Don't mess with them. And be sure to hold the microphone close to your mouth like an ice cream cone so that listeners at home can hear you. We look forward to hearing questions from both visitors here and audience here and audience elsewhere. So please, your first question.
We have a question from home. Is there data for distinguishing between liberal to progressive Protestants who read scriptures in context and fundamentalist Protestants who take every word literally?
I haven't seen really good data on that. I mean, basically, there is, of course, a version of liberal fundamentalism, of social gospel fundamentalism. Okay. And there are continual efforts to promote that, make it more vibrant. But it is a distinct minority. I mean, is it there? Yes. Is it a distinct minority? Yes. I mean, can you be consider yourself an evangelical and believe in the social gospel? Yes. But do the organizations that are evangelical churches promote that and make it easy? Nope. And that's part of the story of organizations here, right? Is that you have to remember when you're talking about a religion, there's the believers and there's the clergy. And the relationship between the believers and the clergy and the ways those two developed semi-together and semi-independently is a large part of the story of religion. Again, the mainstream Protestant churches, I believe at least, got more politically liberal as the education of the clergy promoted that. I think it moved among the clergy before it moved among the followers, and some of the followers coming across that clergy went evangelical. Okay, but so I don't think there's really good. I haven't seen really good numbers. There might be specific studies that look at it, but it's not in terms of the proportion of people who call themselves evangelicals who actually are social liberal. There are some, obviously, right? I mean, all those numbers about how many vote Republican, they don't all vote Republican. You know, but I don't know really good numbers.
Here's kind of a different question. Do you know how often people change their political parties?
Okay, so partisan belief is a weird thing. The answer used to be not all that much, but of course it did change over time, probably because some people are much more loosely affiliated than others. Okay. People used to be more likely to defect from their party on their voting. Right. That people call themselves Republicans and voted for Democrats sometimes, right? And people call themselves Democrats and voted for George Voinovich or whatever. For mayor of Cleveland. Over time, first of all, partisanship has become partisan allegiance or leaning has become more predictive of voting. But also, more and more of the people we call Republicans don't call themselves Republicans. More and more of the people who we call Democrats from surveys don't call themselves Democrats. More and more people call themselves independent. But what was discovered in the 60s and 70s was that more and more people call themselves independent. But the people who call themselves independent, then you ask them, do you lean Republican? Do you lean Democrat? They go, yeah, I lean Democrat. They all voted just like people call themselves Republicans, they call themselves Democrats. The leaders looked a lot in their voting like the people who identified with the party. I'm not a Republican, I just vote like one most of the time. In the 80s and 90s and since, that observation has been refined, either because it changed or because it became better understood what was going on. There are a lot of Americans who hate one political party. And they don't much like the other one. They don't like the other one enough to identify with it. But they always vote against the other one, against the first one. Right? Negative partisanship has become a major aspect of American politics. There are people who hate the Democrats. And they may not like the Republican Party all that much, but they will always vote for the Republican anyway. And there are people who hate the Republicans. And they may not like the Democratic Party very much. Some of them actually far on the left, some of them aren't. But they will, if they vote at all, they will always vote for the Democrat. And so when people talk about polarization, it's not just that the Americans have become more consistent in their voting for one party or another, but it's that they're more likely to hate the other party. Again, see the data about who you let your daughter or son marry. And in that dynamic, there's going to be less changing than there used to be. Now, it remains the case that whatever people identify as, there are going to be more people, I certainly think, who a larger share of the people who show up to vote are going to vote Democratic in 2026 than did in 2024. And a lot of people who showed up to vote voted Republican in 2024 than in 2020. But that is mostly changes among people who aren't really affiliated with the party one way or the other to begin with, who actually are closer to being real independents.
Thank you. Driving home yesterday, I listened to the fundamentalist right-wing radio, and they were discussing the federal law in the works to prevent the establishment of Sharia law enclaves. Is this a real concern, or is this some kind of ruse to establish a Christian nationality?
Well, okay, so Sharia law would be Islamic law. I have no idea what an Islamic law conclave would be. There clearly it's well established that American national law trumps, so to speak, religious law. On the other hand, there are exceptions made. So, for instance, religious organizations don't have to pay taxes. Right? Religious organizations don't have to pay taxes. You have a religious exclusion. Some of the school requirements. There are various under the rubric of religious freedom situations in which people are allowed to not quite follow the law the same way. Avoid vaccines. Right. That's an historic one. Your religion is against taking vaccines. You don't have to take vaccines. Sounds stupid all the time, but nevertheless, there it is. And so there is a history of some exclusions where it is believed, where the idea is that it violates the freedom of religion for the state to do certain things that violate religious beliefs. I don't know about this particular proposal. Okay, I know that it is common to say that Muslims are not real Americans because they want to follow Sharia law. It's not all that different from the claim that John F. Kennedy shouldn't have been president because he was a Catholic and would follow the Pope. Okay. I know that this is a real potential issue in some countries where there are Muslims who would rather follow Sharia law. I mean, there's real issues in France. Okay. So this is potentially a concern. I don't think it's remotely a concern in the United States. I mean, in terms of a legitimate concern, in terms of, as I understand American Muslims, there is a really good amount of research on the differences between American Muslims and French Muslims and German Muslims and English Muslims and so on. And the so-called problem of left loyalty to the country and so on is much less of an issue here. My guess is that the promotion of this idea is not based on good faith concern, but is based on ginning up fear of the other in order to in order to draw lines. For instance, make liberals side with the Muslims because liberals believe in freedom of religion, and therefore make them look bad. Favor the Christian nationalist position, which is that this is really a Christian country. But can you think of situations where this could possibly maybe be a legitimate concern? Yeah, but I doubt it is.
I think that you mentioned earlier that there was a relationship between, in the nuns, a gradation between agnostic and atheistic, and the more atheistic, the more likely to be Democrat.
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about why you think that might be? Like even within the nuns, that there's a difference.
Well, I think that there's two things. Let me see if I can find the data. There's two things obviously going on, I think. One is that if you are claiming yourself an atheist, you believe probably two things. One is that if you go so far as to say I'm an atheist, there's no such thing as God. you basically think that, people believe in God do bad things. That religion has basically been a negative factor in the world. People kill each other over it and stuff like that. They oppress each other over it and stuff like that. And because the logical position is to be agnostic. I'll call myself an atheist. It's extremely unlikely, but I don't know. But to be absolutely sure, I'm not a big fan of absolute sureness. But the first of all, atheists, who are in this state are 82-15 lean Democratic, okay, are taking a position about the damage of religion. And secondly, they generally much more strongly contrast religion and science. And I don't know what this was like 40 years ago, but right now, one party is more clearly the party of science. And one party is more clearly the party, and religion is more clearly associated. And that, by the way, goes back to Stokes. So, belief in science is, as opposed to religion, is more likely to. And again, belief in science means you don't believe things unless you can prove them, which means that what would make me an agnostic would make them atheist. So I think it's a combination of a very negative view of religion and a view of religion as associated with as opposed to science. Agnostic is 76-20, but nothing in particular is 53-39. So there's a big difference between atheists and agnostics on the one hand, and well, I don't really care that much.
I have read that there's a pretty strong correlation between political authoritarianism and, I suppose, fealty is as good a word as any, to religious institutions. It's suggested that extreme fundamentalists may also tend to favor authoritarians in their politics. Is that real? And if so, is there any explanation?
Well, I don't have data on it with me. Okay. A few things. One is that people tend to talk about daddies and mommies, like the daddy state or the mommy state, and with paternalism being associated with a view of the state or the society is disciplining you to behave in certain ways. Okay. Fundamentalism tends to be associated with God the Father, God the Avenger, God the not very nice guy, right? Well, and the fact is that, again, the difference between what I would call Old Testament Judaism and Christianity, what I would call Tanakh, the first 5 books, Judaism and Christianity, and prophetic or New Testament, prophetic Judaism, New Testament Christianity, and to some extent prophetic Christianity. Again, the God of the first 5 books is a God of discipline and punishment and not very niceness. And whereas the God of, God later on, but Jonah is upset because God forgives the people of Nineveh. I'm not sure the God of Deuteronomy would forgive the people of Nineveh. Right. So I think that there is some tendency of authoritarian views to be associated with right-wing politics in general, religious or not. There is less tolerance of disagreement in general. Although remember, all Democrats don't want their kid to marry a Republican, right? So they're not particularly tolerant. There is a fairly strong association between viewing the government is there to help out people and take care of them, which is more the liberal position. I think the government is there to discipline people, which is somewhat more the conservative position. Christian nationalism in particular, which is 20% of the public, roughly. Certainly is more daddy God than mommy God. So there's an affiliation there, but I don't have data with me that could help me answer it.
Some of these people that goes around and collect signatures on petitions and talk to people in the neighborhood and that sort of thing. I want to share an observation and get your comment on it, which is, yes, there's a lot of people who are like, give me that thing and let me sign it right now. But there's a significant proportion of people in my neighborhood who feel that any affiliation with a political party is contaminating them. They are not going to be involved in all those dirty things, and they're not going to vote, and they're not, and to have any conversation with them about engaging in the political process makes them feel ashamed and dirty. Is there any avenue, religious identity or otherwise, that might counter that principled withholding from the civic commons?
I'll be interested to know what the clergy here says about that. So I've always said that the basic problem in teaching American politics is that politics is sort of dirty and depressing and miserable. People cheat. They cheat for a higher cause, they think, but they cheat. They manipulate. They make trades. Any of you ever read Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail by Hunter Thompson long ago? So there's a point where he's talking about Richard Nixon, and he says, and Richard Nixon or any other major president, he gets up in the morning to shave, looks at himself in the mirror and knows that at some point that day, he is going to do something that he would not want his mother, his children, his wife, his best friend to know anything about. That being a really serious politician is a morally compromised position. Okay. And I teach about politics, and I worry that the problem is that if I'm frank about the less pleasant aspects of politics, the manipulative push of politics, then people say, well, I don't want to be part of that game. And here's the problem. If people have that reaction, then of course, the only people who play are the cheaters, right? The only people who play are and so the question morally is how to maintain your moral compass while playing the game. So, for instance, you don't go too far down that road of, well, the end justifies the means, right? Because that's not a good thing. And of course, there are people where the boundary is really close. Look at Lyndon B. Johnson, who was not a nice guy, but did incredibly good stuff. I mean, except for that little war. Sort of blew it on that one, but it's not bad, okay? So I think that the Jewish answer from some Jewish tradition would be that part of your role in life is to repair the world. That's what Tikkun Olam means. And you don't expect you to repair the whole world. The world is an evil, it's a happy place in many, many ways. It's also a happy place in many, many ways. You sort of add to the beauty and diminish the ugliness. And that is what your role as a human being is. It's part of being a good human being. You are not judged by success. You are judged by the effort. Similarly, in Catholicism to some extent. Alice Bach, who used to be the Hallinan professor at Case Western and was a lefty and Dorothy Day person and all that. She said, you do this stuff for your own soul. Okay? So that's the answer to the extent that there's an answer. I mean, there's two parts to the answer. One is that if you don't participate, you're leaving it for the asshole. Right? Which is sort of what's happened to us. But the second aspect of it is you do it because that is the way you live a moral life. And living a moral life is worthwhile for its own sake. You hope you win. You hope you succeed. But you try because you should.
Professor White, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and thank the audience for some fine
Great question.
questions. Next Sunday, March 1st, the topic of our forum, which begins at 9, will be artificial intelligence in healthcare. I know that this is something that we're all interested in, and so we will see you here in more or less 2 weeks. You're welcome to attend our 10:15 service, either upstairs or the sanctuary. In the sanctuary, wait a minute, upstairs in the sanctuary, or on our YouTube video, YouTube page. To see what else is happening in our congregation, please check out our website, ucleveland.org. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Professor White. Have a great week.
Thank you.